The fire had taken everything from Vernon Garrett by the time the last ember cooled, and he stood in the gray morning light staring at the ash where his life used to be, thinking that there was nothing left in this world worth reaching for. It had started sometime after midnight, that much he knew. He had been asleep in the small room behind Dawson's feed and grain where he'd been boarding since selling off the last of his cattle 3 months prior, and when the shout went up from the street, he had barely made it out with his boots in one hand and his hat in the other. The feed store was gone. The stable attached to it was gone. His saddle, the one his father had oiled and restitched for 20 years, was gone. The lockbox he'd kept under his cot, with the $47 he'd scraped together over 2 seasons of punching cattle for other men's herds, was gone. Everything was simply gone. It was the summer of 1878 in the small town of Harlan Creek, Texas, a place that sat along a flat stretch of brown prairie about 12 miles east of the Brazos River. The town was not large enough to be important and not small enough to be forgotten. It had a saloon, a church, a general mercantile, a doctor's office that doubled as a barber shop when Dr. Elias Putnam was in a charitable mood, a post office, and enough stubborn people to make up 2 or 3 good arguments on any given day. The drought that had come down through the summer had dried the grass to the color of straw, and it had been the loose spark from a kicked-over lantern in the back room of Dawson's that had done the damage. The investigation, such as it was conducted by Sheriff Cal Briggs and lasted about 40 minutes. Lantern fire, accident, move along. Vernon was 28 years old and he had been broke before, but he had never been broke in this particular way, which was the kind of broke that also hollows out the chest. He had no family left in Harlan Creek. His mother had passed 3 years prior. His father had died of a fever down in San Antonio before Vernon was old enough to remember much more than a broad pair of shoulders and a smell like cedar and leather. He had one friend in town, a Mexican cattle hand named Paco Reyes, who slept in a bunkhouse on the Teller Ranch on the north side of town, and Paco had come to stand beside him in the ash and smoke that morning and said simply, "What do you need, amigo?" Vernon had not known how to answer that question. He was not a man who found asking easy. He spent the first 2 days after the fire sleeping in the hayloft of the Teller Ranch bunkhouse because Paco had arranged it with the foreman, a taciturn man named Gus Holland, who said nothing about it either way, which Vernon took to mean yes. He ate at the long table with the other hands, 6 men in all, mostly quiet types who smelled of horse and sun, and he did not speak much, and they did not press him. He thought about leaving Harlan Creek entirely. He thought about drifting north toward the Panhandle or west toward New Mexico territory, where a man could sometimes find work with a freighting company or on a survey crew. He thought about all the places a man could go when he had nothing to hold him, and the thinking made him feel smaller instead of larger, which surprised him. On the morning of the 3rd day, he walked back into town to see about buying breakfast on credit at the saloon, which sometimes sold eggs in the mornings when the cook, an enormously wide woman named Bessie Crane, was in a generous frame of mind. He was halfway down the main street when he heard the creak and rattle of a wagon coming up behind him, moving at a pace that suggested the driver was not in any hurry, but also was not interested in stopping. He stepped to the side of the road and did not turn around, and the wagon rolled past him, and then, 20 feet ahead, it stopped. He looked up. The wagon was a flatbed, good solid construction, pulled by 2 sturdy bay horses who looked like they had been worked hard but cared for well. The wagon bed was loaded with lumber, rough-cut pine planks, a stack of them tied down with rope, along with a canvas sack that clinked when the wagon shifted, and what appeared to be a crate of tools. Sitting on the wagon box was a woman he had never seen before. She was perhaps 25, with dark reddish-brown hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better decades, and she wore a practical linen shirt and a canvas riding skirt with boots that had honest mud on them. She was holding a folded piece of paper in her left hand and looking at him with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who has been given a job and intends to complete it. "Are you Vernon Garrett?" she said. He stared at her. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She held up the folded paper. "I have a list." He had no idea what to say to that. "My name is Etta Wilcox," she said, still in that same matter-of-fact tone. "My father is Henry Wilcox. He owns the lumber yard in Caldwell. He heard about the fire from the supply rider who came through 3 days ago, and he sent me with what you need to start rebuilding. He knew your father." Vernon felt something move in his chest that was not quite emotion and not quite anger, but was something in the vicinity of both. He stood in the road and looked at the lumber stacked on the wagon and then looked at Etta Wilcox and said, "Ma'am, I don't know your father and I can't take charity." "It's not charity," she said without any particular heat. She unfolded the paper. "It's a list. I've got 16 pine planks, 2 by 8, 12 feet long, 4 cross beams, 140 cut nails, a draw knife, a handsaw, a hammer, and enough roofing tin to cover a 12 by 12 structure. I also have a letter from my father that says you have credit at the yard for another load once you've established yourself again, payable over 2 years at no interest." She folded the paper again. "None of which is charity. It's a business arrangement based on the fact that your father helped my father in 1859 when his mill burned down, and Henry Wilcox is not a man who forgets a debt." Vernon stood in the road with his hat in his hand, the sun already hot at 8 in the morning, and he did not know whether to feel relieved or humiliated or grateful, and the mixture of the three made him look away down the street and say nothing for a long moment. "I don't know what my father did," he finally said. "He never mentioned it." "No," Etta said, "he wouldn't have. From what my father tells me, your father was that kind of man." She gathered the reins. "Now, do you have a piece of land or a lot to build on, or do we need to sort that out first?" There was something so entirely practical about the way she said it, so completely stripped of pity or performance, that Vernon found himself actually thinking about the answer instead of standing there feeling sorry for himself. He did own a quarter-acre lot on the south edge of town. He had bought it 2 years ago with the intention of building a proper house, had done nothing with it except pay the annual assessment to the county, and it was still there, his by deed, dry and flat and waiting. "South end of town," he said. "Lot 6 on the survey." "Good," Etta said. "Get on the wagon." He got on the wagon. They drove the short distance to the lot in silence, which was not uncomfortable, but was the kind of silence that happens between two people who are both thinking hard. The lot was exactly as Vernon had left it, a rectangle of cracked earth with a few stubborn mesquite shrubs along the back edge, and a flat rock he had set down himself as a marker for the future foundation corner. Etta drove the horses in and sat looking at the lot for a moment, and Vernon sat beside her and looked at it too, and for a strange, suspended moment they were both simply looking at the same piece of ground. 12 by 16, she said. "You can do it in 2 weeks if you work steady." "I can work steady," he said. "I know," she said, and she said it as though she had already made that assessment and recorded it somewhere. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for any assistance, which startled him, because in his experience women tended to either wait or make a small theatrical production of not waiting. Etta Wilcox simply climbed down, landed in the dirt, opened the canvas sack to check the nail supply, and began untying the rope that held the lumber. He jumped down and caught the end of the rope. "I'll do that." She let him take it without argument, but she did not step back entirely. She stood by the first stack of planks with her list and began to call them off. 16 planks present, 4 beams present, nails, hammer, handsaw, draw knife present. The roofing tin was rolled and tied at the back of the wagon bed. She checked it, noted it on the list, and then folded the list and tucked it into her shirt pocket. "I need to return to Caldwell by tonight," she said. "Are you clear on the credit arrangement? 2 years, no interest, second load when you're ready." "I understood it," he said. He was unloading the planks and setting them on the flat rock to keep them off the ground. "Miss Wilcox, I don't know how to." "Don't," she said pleasantly. He stopped. He looked at her. "I have noticed," Etta said, that when men feel as though they are accepting something they did not earn, they make a very long speech of gratitude in order to put the debt at a comfortable distance. I don't want the speech, Mr. Garrett. The debt is already settled. It was settled before I loaded this wagon. Just build a good house. He stared at her for a long moment. The sun was bright, and it caught the copper in her hair where it came out from under the hat brim. There was a smudge of something that might have been sawdust on her left cheek. She was looking at him with complete even patience and absolutely zero softness, and Vernon Garrett, who had never been rendered speechless by a woman or much else, found that he had nothing to say. "All right," he finally said. "Good." She turned back to the wagon. "I'll help you unload the tin. It takes 2 people. They unloaded the tin together. They also, without particularly discussing it, moved all the lumber off the wagon and stacked it in a workable sequence near the foundation corner. It took the better part of an hour. By the time the wagon was empty, both of them were sweating, and Vernon had split the web of his thumb on a nail head but had said nothing about it. And Etta had at some point removed her hat, hung it on the wagon rail, and was working in the full sun with her hair coming loose from its tie in a way that she seemed entirely unbothered by. When the last piece of material was arranged to her satisfaction, which was a more particular satisfaction than he had anticipated, she climbed back onto the wagon box and settled the reins. "Caldwell is a day's ride east," she said. "If you need the second load before spring, send word to Wilcox Lumber and we'll arrange delivery." "Miss Wilcox," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. "I know you said not to, but I am saying it anyway." She considered him for a moment. Something moved at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile and not quite a dismissal. Then she gathered the reins, clucked to the horses, and drove out of the lot and back onto the road heading east, and Vernon Garrett stood alone in the dirt of his empty quarter-acre lot and watched the wagon until it was a small moving shape against the flat Texas horizon. He stood there longer than he needed to. He began building the next morning. He had the framework up in 4 days. Paco came by after his evening shift 2 days running and helped him set the corner posts and nail the floor joists. And a man named Tom Briley, who ran the blacksmith shop on the north end of town, stopped one afternoon and looked at the framing with a critical eye and said, "Your east wall is going to lean if you don't brace it better," and then stayed for 3 hours helping him brace it better. These were small acts of practical kindness that Vernon accepted without the awkward ceremony that Etta Wilcox had correctly identified as a kind of emotional armor, and he was grateful in a quieter, more functional way. But he thought about her. He thought about her at odd moments, not in a romantic or fanciful way, he told himself, but in the way a man thinks about a thing that has unsettled him and that he has not yet sorted to a proper place. The directness of her, the complete absence of performance or sentiment. She had driven a full day from Caldwell with a wagon load of lumber for a man she had never met, had efficiently unloaded the lumber, refused his gratitude, and driven home. There was something so brisk and competent and quietly extraordinary about the whole encounter that it kept surfacing in his mind when he was working alone, usually when he was doing something physical and rhythmic like nailing boards, which left his mind free to wander. He wondered if she was married. He then thought about why he was wondering that, which was not a productive line of thinking, and returned his attention to the boards. The house went up in 12 days. It was not grand, a single-room structure, 12 by 16 as Etta had predicted, with a plank floor and a proper door frame and 2 windows that he had traded 2 weeks of fence work for with a glazier in Milford, a town 8 miles south. The roofing tin went on straight and solid. He built a small stone chimney over 2 days with rocks gathered from the Dry Creek bed behind the Teller property. By the time he had the interior smoothed and a proper latch on the door, it was the first week of August, and the heat was so extreme that the nails in the south wall were too hot to touch in the afternoon. He stood inside the finished house on the last evening, the sun going down through the window in a long orange slant, dust motes drifting, the smell of fresh pine and mineral stone in the air, and felt something he had not felt in a long time, which was the specific and exact opposite of helplessness. He thought about writing to Wilcox Lumber to order the second load. He thought about delivering the letter himself. He told himself that was a foolish idea, driven by an even more foolish fascination with a woman who had shown him no particular interest and had very firmly not encouraged any sentiment. He told himself this with some conviction. And then he saddled the horse he had borrowed from Paco for the week, a steady gray named Biscuit who was not young but was sensible, and rode into town to the post office. He stood at the post office counter for a long time with a blank piece of paper. He wrote, "Miss Wilcox, the first structure is complete. I am ready for the second load when convenient. The credit arrangement is appreciated. Regards, Vernon Garrett, Lot 6, Harlan Creek." He looked at it. It was the most impersonal message he had ever written, and it was entirely appropriate, and he sent it. 3 weeks passed. He spent those weeks doing odd jobs, helping Tom Briley at the smithy, hauling water for the widow Dorrance who lived at the east end of town and was 73, and had no one else to ask, fixing fence line for Gus Holland in exchange for continuing use of the Teller bunkhouse until his own place was properly furnished. He scrubbed the new floor twice. He built a shelf along the east wall. He made a table from a leftover plank and 2 sawhorses that he later replaced with proper legs he cut from a second mesquite tree he'd taken down clearing the lot. On a Friday morning in late August, he heard wheels on the road. He was outside splitting kindling near the south side of the house, and he straightened up with the axe in his hand and looked down the road, and there was the flatbed wagon with the 2 bay horses and the stack of lumber, and on the wagon box in the same wide-brimmed hat was Etta Wilcox. He stood very still for a moment. She drove onto the lot and stopped and looked at the house. She sat there for a full 10 seconds just looking at it, and Vernon watched her look at it, and then she turned to him and said, "It's straight." "It is," he said. "The chimney is good work. I had time." She climbed down from the wagon's same quick, unassisted motion and stood in the lot with her hands on her hips and looked at the structure with the eye of someone who knows lumber and construction and is making a real assessment rather than a polite one. She walked the perimeter. She looked at the foundation corners. She looked at the roof tin seams. She tried the door latch. She looked at the windows. "You measured the window frames yourself," she said. "Traded work for them over in Milford." She nodded. "Good trade." He was aware, standing there in the bright August morning with sawdust on his shirt, that he was immensely glad to see her and that this was a piece of information he was going to have to do something responsible with at some point. "I brought the second load," she said unnecessarily, since it was plainly visible on the wagon. "I can see that." He put the axe down. "What's on it this time?" She produced the list from her shirt pocket. He had noticed, the first time, that she kept the list in her shirt pocket and not her skirt pocket, and he had thought at the time that it was a practical choice, since the shirt pocket was more accessible when working. He noticed it again now with the same appreciation for the logic of it. "Cedar planks for interior shelving or a second-room partition," she said. "More cut nails. A second window frame that my father included at no charge because he had it sitting in the yard. 20 feet of stovepipe in sections, and a proper iron door hinge set because I noticed from your letter that you didn't mention hardware and most men forget hardware." Vernon looked at her. "I did forget hardware." "I know," she said, with the same mild, untriumphant manner she had said everything. "Are you going to add a second room?" "I was thinking about it." "You should. This structure is strong enough and the lot has room." She looked at the east side of the house. "Put it on the east side. Better morning light." He looked at the east side. He looked back at her. "You want to come inside?" She looked at him, just the briefest shift in her expression that was so fast he might have imagined it, and then said, "Yes, all right." He held the door open and she walked in, and he followed her, and they stood in the single room of the house he had built from the lumber she had brought him, and the morning light came in clean and direct through the south window, and the whole place smelled of pine and the faint mineral smell of the stone chimney, and it was very quiet. Etta looked at the shelf along the east wall, the table with its proper legs, the swept floor, the stone hearth. She looked at all of it the way she looked at everything, which was thoroughly and without embellishment. "You built this in 12 days," she said. 12 and a half. She turned and looked at him. She was standing about 5 feet away in the small room, and the morning light was on her face, and she was not wearing any particular expression except the one she always wore, which was attentive and direct and somehow deeply, quietly alive. "Vernon Garrett," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. "You are not what I expected." He looked at her. "What did you expect?" "A man who had given up," she said honestly. "We heard the fire took everything, and in my experience when a fire takes everything it usually takes the spirit along with the material goods, but you didn't give up. You built something good from what I brought you." She paused. "I'm glad of it." He was quiet for a moment. Something in his chest was doing something that he was not going to examine at this particular moment. "Why did you really come yourself?" he said. "The first time. Your father could have sent a hand with the wagon." She was quiet in return. Outside, one of the bay horses shifted and blew through its nose. A bird said something briefly in one of the mesquite shrubs. "He offered to," she said. "I asked to go instead." "Why?" She looked at him with that direct, serious gaze. "Because your father helped mine when no one else would, and I wanted to see what kind of man his son was." There it was, honest and plain. He stood across the room from her and felt that there was more to the answer than she had given, but that she was a woman who moved at her own pace and on her own terms, and that pressing her would be the wrong thing to do entirely. "And," he said anyway, because he could not help it. The corner of her mouth moved again. This time it was definitely something like a smile, small and warm and gone before it fully arrived. "And I got my answer," she said, and walked back out through the door. He helped her unload the second wagon. It took longer this time because there was more on it, and because they were not in quite as much of a hurry, or at least Vernon was not in a hurry, and Etta moved at the same reliable, efficient pace she seemed to move at in all things. When the stovepipe sections were laid out, and the window frame was propped against the east wall where the second room would go, and the cedar planks were stacked in a way that would let them dry a few more days before use, she put her hands together and dusted them off, and stood looking at the lot with the expression of someone checking a task off a list. "I'll need to start back," she said. "The road south of the creek crossing gets soft in afternoon if there's been any rain, and I don't want the wagon stuck." "I understand," he said. He walked to the horses' heads and checked the rigging from habit, which was something you did when you'd worked around horses all your life. "Both bays were good animals, calm and well-fed. These are good horses. My father bought them from a breeder in Austin," she said. She was climbing up to the wagon box. "He has 4 more. I broke 2 of them myself." He looked up at her. "You break horses." "My brothers were all older and all married by the time I was old enough to help with the real work," she said, settling the reins. "Someone had to learn." He stepped back from the horses' heads. He looked up at her against the blue and white August sky, the hat back on her head, the reins easy in her hands, and there was something in that image that he knew he was going to carry for a long time. "Miss Wilcox," he said. "Etta," she said, not looking at him but at the road ahead. He took a breath. "Etta, I'd like to come to Caldwell." She was still looking at the road. "What for?" "To settle the account with your father properly," he said, "face to face." Now she looked at him, those direct eyes measuring. "That's courteous of him to receive you," she said carefully. "I'd also like to see how the lumber yard operates," he said, which was true and also not entirely the point. "I'm thinking about whether there might be work in that direction." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "We could use an extra hand in the yard this fall. Busy season for lumber." "That's so." "It is," she said. "Come Saturday if you like. We're on the eastern edge of town past the granary. You'll see the sign." "I'll be there," he said. She turned back to the road and put the horses in motion, and for the second time Vernon Garrett stood in the dirt of his lot and watched Etta Wilcox and her wagon grow smaller against the Texas horizon. This time he did not tell himself the fascination was foolish. He rode to Caldwell on a Saturday. He left Harlan Creek at first light, borrowed Biscuit from Paco again, and made the 12-mile ride east in just under 3 hours given the horse's age and the heat. Caldwell was larger than Harlan Creek, the kind of town that had grown up around the intersection of two trading routes and had developed a certain comfortable permanence because of it. There was a proper hotel, several mercantiles, a newspaper, 2 churches, a school, and considerably more noise and movement than Vernon was used to. Wilcox Lumber was where Etta had said, past the granary, a large operation with a proper sign in black and red paint, a wide yard stacked with sorted lumber, and an attached mill shed from which came the intermittent scream of a saw blade through green wood. The smell of fresh-cut pine in the heat was enormous and good. Vernon tied Biscuit at the fence post and stood for a moment looking at the operation. It was substantial. The family clearly knew what they were doing. He found Henry Wilcox in the mill shed office, a small room off the main building that smelled of sawdust and pipe tobacco and old paper, a man of about 60, with the wide, capable hands of someone who had worked timber all his life and white hair that had once been red. He had Etta's eyes, which was the first thing Vernon noticed, the same direct, assessing quality that missed nothing. Henry stood up when Vernon came to the door and put out his hand, and they shook, and Henry Wilcox looked at him with the kind of long, slow look that takes full stock of a man. "Sit down," Henry said, and Vernon sat. "I came to settle the account properly," Vernon said. Henry shook his head. "There's nothing to settle. I told Etta to tell you that." "She did. I'm here anyway." Henry looked at him for a moment, and then a slow smile moved across his face, the kind that starts in the eyes rather than the mouth. "Your daddy was a good man," Henry said. "Robert Garrett helped me at my lowest point without a word of complaint and without asking for anything in return. Told me the only way I could repay him was to help somebody else someday when they needed it." Henry folded his hands on the desk. "You needed it." Vernon felt the old weight in his chest, the particular one that came with thinking about his father, and he kept his face still and his voice even. "I appreciate it more than I can say properly." "You don't have to say anything. Your daddy already said it 20 years ago." Henry leaned back. "Etta tells me you're interested in work at the yard this fall. If there's something useful I can do. Can you run a saw?" "Yes." "Can you grade lumber? Know the difference between first and second cut?" "I can learn quickly." Henry looked at him steadily. "She also tells me you built a solid 12 by 16 in 12 days from what she brought you." 12 and a half, Vernon said. Henry smiled wider. "Man who doesn't round his numbers favorably, I like that." He stood up and put out his hand again. "You start Monday. 40 cents a day to start. I'll board you at the house if you don't have arrangements. We've got a room off the kitchen that's been sitting empty since my youngest went to Waco." This was moving faster than Vernon had anticipated, and in a direction that was generous beyond what he had expected. But he had learned from Etta that the Wilcox family did not perform generosity for effect, and that declining it on prideful grounds was its own kind of foolishness. "Thank you," he said, and shook Henry's hand. He met Etta's mother that evening at supper, Etta Wilcox, a firm, warm woman who had clearly been beautiful when she was young, and was still handsome in the way that strong-featured women are when they age gracefully. She asked Vernon direct questions about where he came from, and what he knew about timber work, and whether he took his coffee with anything, and she was so entirely her daughter at twice the age that Vernon found himself nearly smiling. Etta herself sat across the table from him and ate her supper, and participated in the conversation with her usual directness, and said nothing that was personal or significant. And Vernon ate his supper and talked to Henry about lumber grading, and said nothing that was personal or significant. And Etta Wilcox watched the two of them with the expression of a woman who has spent her whole life reading the weather. He started work on Monday. He was good at physical work, and he learned quickly, which were his two most reliable qualities, and the lumber yard was demanding in both respects. The fall rush was real farms and ranches taking advantage of the cooler building weather, a new hotel going up in the center of Caldwell that required a large standing order, various smaller jobs that needed to be cut, graded, loaded, and delivered. Vernon threw himself into the work with the full energy of a man who has been idle long enough to feel the restlessness in his bones, and within 2 weeks Gus at the mill said to Henry that the new hand was the best worker they'd had in 3 years. He saw Etta every day. It was impossible not to, given that he lived and worked on the same property, but the quality of seeing her every day was different from what he might have expected. She worked in the yard herself on busy days, measuring, grading, managing the accounts in the front office with a competence that made it clear she was as much a part of the business as her father. She was matter-of-fact with him during work hours in the same way she was matter-of-fact about everything, and if there was any particular awareness between them, she did not let it show in the daylight. But there were evenings. After supper, when Henry and Alina retired early in the way of people who rise before dawn, Etta would sometimes sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and look at the darkening sky, and one evening Vernon came out with his own cup and said, "Room for 2 out here." And she said, "It's a wide enough porch," and he sat down. They talked about practical things at first, the cedar shipment from the hill country that was running late, the best way to cure pine against weather checking, the new hotel project, and whether the contractor had ordered enough joist material for the upper floor. These were comfortable, substantive conversations, and Vernon discovered that talking with Etta was one of the best things he had done in quite some time, because she was genuinely intelligent and had no interest in filling silence with noise. Gradually, the conversations moved past practical things. He told her about his father, the real things, not the public eulogy version but the actual man, the one who had a habit of singing to himself very quietly when he thought no one was listening, who had kept a collection of interesting rocks on a shelf in the barn for no reason anyone could ever determine, who had made one enormous mistake in his 40s that had cost him his small ranch, and from which he had rebuilt himself through sheer determined work. Vernon had never told those particular stories to anyone, and they came out quietly, with the slight roughness of things that haven't been spoken aloud before. Etta listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "He sounds like a man who learned the right lessons from a hard experience." "He did," Vernon said. "It was the making of him in some ways." "Fires do that," she said, "the literal ones and the other kind." He looked at her sideways. The porch was dark except for the light from the kitchen window and the enormous Texas stars overhead. "Is that why you came yourself, the first time with the wagon?" She was quiet for a moment. "Partly." "What's the other part?" She turned her cup in her hands. She was looking at the dark yard and the shapes of the lumber stacks against the night sky. "My father said Robert Garrett's son had lost everything," she said slowly, "and that he was alone in Harlan Creek with no family, and I thought about what that means, to have nothing left and no one coming." She paused. "I thought someone should come." Vernon did not say anything for a long time. He sat with the simple plain truth of it, with what it meant that a woman he had never met had thought someone should come and had then simply come herself, with lumber and a list and no fuss about it. "I was in a bad way," he said quietly, "standing in that ash. I was in a worse way than I let on." "I know," she said. "How?" "Because you didn't look me in the eye the first time I pulled up in the road," she said. "Not really. You looked at me, but you were looking through me. That's what a person looks like when they've stopped believing anything is coming." He thought about that. The accuracy of it settled somewhere uncomfortable and necessary in his chest. "And then you kept looking," he said. She turned her head and looked at him directly, the way she always did, and there was something in her face now in the dark and the starlight that was not the daytime expression, not the business face or the practical face, but something quieter and deeper that she did not usually let show. "Yes," she said simply. He set his coffee cup down on the porch rail. He looked at her. "Etta, Vernon, "I would very much like to take you somewhere," he said. "Not for any particular reason except that I think we could both use something that isn't work for an afternoon. Is there a place you'd like to go?" She looked at him for a moment. Then that corner-of-the-mouth thing happened again, the one that had been driving him gently and persistently to distraction for 3 weeks. "There's a creek south of town," she said. "It's not much to look at in the drought, but there's shade." "Shade sounds good," he said. "Saturday afternoon," she said. "I have to finish the hotel account in the morning." "Saturday afternoon," he agreed. They sat on the porch in companionable silence for another 20 minutes before the night air and the long day's work drove them inside. And Vernon went to his room off the kitchen and lay on the narrow bed and looked at the dark ceiling and felt, with a clarity that was almost startling, exactly where he was in relation to this woman, and exactly where he wanted to be. He was not a man who rushed things. But he was also a man who recognized, when the ground had shifted under him, that it had shifted. Saturday came and they rode south of town together. Etta on a compact chestnut mare she called Clover, and Vernon on the steady gray Biscuit, who had now been borrowed for so long that Paco had sent word he was welcome to the horse indefinitely, which Vernon took as the gift of friendship that it was. The creek was dry in its center, but there were green willows along the bank and genuine shade, and they tied the horses and walked along the bank and talked. And it was the first time Vernon had been completely at ease with another person in longer than he could easily remember. She talked about her own life with the same candor that she brought to everything. She had grown up in this lumber business, had been educated by her mother at home, and then 2 years at a small women's school in San Antonio, had come back because the business needed her, and because, she said with a dry sideways look, she had found the social expectations of San Antonio somewhat exhausting. "What kind of expectations?" he asked. "The kind that say a woman's primary occupation should be the selection of appropriate furniture and the management of dinner guests," she said. He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that surprises you. "That does sound like a poor use of your time." "I thought so," she said. She was walking along the dry creek bank with her hat in her hand, her hair loose around her shoulders in the afternoon heat, and she looked different from the working version of herself, and also exactly the same. "My brothers all thought I would marry by 20, and that would resolve the question. I am 25 and the question remains unresolved." There was an opening there, and they both knew it. Vernon walked beside her and felt the opening and chose to step through it carefully rather than all at once. "What would resolve it?" he said. She stopped walking and turned to face him. They were standing in the green shade under a willow with the dry creek bed white and silent beside them and the afternoon heat pressing in around the edges of the shade, and she looked at him with the full direct weight of her attention. "A man who doesn't require me to be smaller than I am," she said, "and who I can respect as fully as I want to be respected." He held her gaze. "That's a fair answer. It's an honest one." "Etta," he said, "I have respected you from the first moment you told me you had a list and refused to take my thanks for it." Something crossed her face then, something genuine and unguarded that she did not quite manage to control before he saw it. "That's a strange beginning for a declaration," she said, but her voice had changed slightly, something softer at the edges of it. "I mean it as the highest compliment I know how to give," he said. She looked at him for a long, still moment in the willow shade with the afternoon light coming through the leaves in small moving pieces. Then she said, "I know you do," and she said it quietly, and the softness in her voice now was something he wanted very much to keep. He did not kiss her that afternoon. It was too soon for it, and they were both the kind of people who understood that. But when they rode back to the lumber yard in the late afternoon with the sky going pink and orange behind the flat horizon, they rode close enough that their knees occasionally touched, and neither of them moved away. That was enough. For now it was more than enough. The weeks passed in a rhythm that had a sweetness to it that Vernon had not known before. Work in the day, supper with the family, evenings on the porch. More Saturdays. They rode to see the Caldwell Fair when it came in September. They drove out one Sunday after church to look at a piece of land that Henry Wilcox was considering for a timber stand, and Etta walked the property with her hands in her pockets and gave her assessment of the soil and the drainage with such calm expertise that Henry deferred to her judgment entirely. And Vernon watched this, and felt the particular and expanding happiness of a man watching someone he loves at the full height of what they are. He had not yet used that word, even internally. But he used it now, and it settled quietly into place like a well-fitted board. There was a Wednesday evening in October when the temperature had dropped enough to make the porch genuinely pleasant, and they were sitting in the near dark with their coffee, and the conversation had wandered into comfortable silence, and Etta said, unprompted, "You're staying, aren't you, in Caldwell?" He looked at her. "What makes you ask?" "You haven't talked about Harlan Creek in 2 weeks," she said. "You built a house there and it's sitting empty." "I know. That doesn't bother you," he set his cup down. He turned to look at her directly, the way she had always looked at him. "Etta, I built that house because I needed to prove to myself that I could. It was never about the house. It was about knowing I wasn't finished." He paused. "What I'm not finished with is here." She looked at him steadily. "That is a more direct statement than you usually make," she said. "I've been waiting to be sure of it," he said. "I'm sure of it." She was quiet for a moment. The night sounds of the town came softly from a distance, a dog, a wagon, someone playing a guitar somewhere down the street. The stars were bright and enormous overhead. "My father asked me last week what I thought of you," she said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were the most capable and quietly stubborn person I had met in recent memory," she said, "and that I found that combination insufferably attractive." He was very still. "Insufferably," he said. "I meant it affectionately," she said, and now the smile came fully, properly, for the first time since he had known her, warm and genuine and brilliant, entirely unlike the small controlled things she usually permitted, and it caught him so completely off guard that he just looked at it for a moment the way you look at something rare. "Etta," he said. "Yes." "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and I'm going to ask you to receive it plainly, without any ceremony, because I think that's how you prefer things." "It is," she agreed. "I am in love with you," he said, "completely and without the least remaining doubt. I have been since approximately the 3rd week of September, but probably earlier than that if I am being honest about the timeline." She looked at him for a long, serious moment. Then she said, "Vernon Garrett, I have been in love with you since you stood in the road in Harlan Creek looking at my wagon with your hat in your hand and not a single thing in the world to your name. And I thought, there is a man who is not broken." He exhaled. He reached across the porch and took her hand, and she turned her palm up and took his, and they sat there in the dark with their hands together, and the stars overhead, and the night sounds of Caldwell around them. And it was the most significant and complete moment Vernon had experienced in his life. He asked Henry Wilcox for his daughter the following Sunday after breakfast, at the kitchen table with the cup still on it and Alina conspicuously finding something to do in the next room that did not require her presence but allowed perfect acoustic access to the conversation. Henry looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Does she know you're asking me?" "No," Vernon said. Henry nodded slowly. "Good. She would have had something to say about the order of operations." He folded his hands. "And you intend to take care of her?" "To the best of my ability and then some," Vernon said. "I also intend to let her take care of things herself when she has a better handle on them than I do, which will be often." Henry's face did the same thing Etta's face did when something pleased it unexpectedly, the involuntary, genuine expression before the controlled one could assert itself. "You understand her," he said. "I'm learning her," Vernon said. "I expect I'll be learning her for a long time." Henry put his hand out across the table. "Then you have my blessing, Vernon." Vernon shook his hand, and Alina appeared immediately from the next room with no pretense whatsoever that she had not been listening, and she took both of Vernon's hands in hers and looked at him with wet eyes and said, "I knew it when I watched you eat your first supper here. You looked at her like she was the most interesting thing in the room." "She was," Vernon said simply. He asked Etta that evening. He did not do it with ceremony or staging. He found her in the front office going over the accounts by lamplight, the same position he'd found her in 100 times, and he walked in and stood on the other side of the desk and said, "Etta, stop the accounts for a minute." She looked up. She read his face in that complete and immediate way she had of reading things, and she set the ledger pen down. He came around the desk and crouched down beside her chair so he was at her level, so he was looking up at her, and he took her hand in both of his. "I have nothing very eloquent prepared," he said. "You know I am a better carpenter than I am a speechmaker. But what I have is this. I intend to spend the rest of my life being exactly the kind of man you came to Harlan Creek expecting to find, and the kind of man you found instead, and I want to do that as your husband." Etta looked at him for a long moment with her hand in his and the lamplight on her face and the smell of sawdust and ink around them. "You are making a speech," she said. "I'm trying not to," he said. "It's a good speech," she said. Her voice was soft and her eyes were bright, and she was not performing either of those things. They were simply true. "Yes, Vernon, yes." He stood up and she stood with him, and he held her face in his hands and kissed her properly for the first time, not tentative, not uncertain, but full and warm and entirely sure. And she kissed him back with the same quality that she brought to everything she did, which was complete and genuine, and without a single wasted gesture. They were married in November of 1878 at the Caldwell Church in a small ceremony with Henry and Eleanor, and two of Etta's brothers, Jacob and William, both of whom shook Vernon's hand with the look of men who had done their assessment and been satisfied, and Paco Reyes, who had made the 12-mile ride from Harlan Creek in his Sunday clothes, looking enormously pleased with the whole situation. The Reverend was a thin man named Moore who said the words with feeling, and Etta wore her mother's dress which she had taken in at the waist herself because, as she had explained to Eleanor, the fit was slightly off and she had the sewing skill to correct it. And Vernon wore the best shirt he owned and had his hair cut by Dr. Putnam, who had made the trip in a professional and friendly capacity. And when the Reverend said, "You may kiss your bride," Vernon kissed her in a way that made Eleanor cover her smile with her glove and made Paco say something appreciative in Spanish. They went back to the lumber yard house for the wedding supper, and afterward Vernon and Etta sat on the porch together as they had done so many evenings before, except now they sat closer together, her shoulder against his arm, his hand around hers on the porch rail. "What happens now?" she said. It was not an anxious question, just a genuine one. "Now we figure it out together," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been thinking about Harlan Creek." He looked at her. "What about it?" "You have a house there," she said. "A good one. And Harlan Creek has a lumber yard in Milford 8 miles south, but nothing closer. The town is growing." She paused. "My father would extend credit for stock and materials to start a yard there. I would run it as well as you. Together we could build something substantial." He looked at her in the dark and felt that expanding, rolling happiness that seemed to have no ceiling when it came to this woman. "You've been planning this," he said. "I've been considering the logistics," she said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes," she said. "Planning implies certainty. I was waiting to see what you thought before I committed to certainty." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles. "Etta Garrett," he said, using the name for the first time. She looked at him. "That's new." "It is," he said. "I like it." She looked at the stars for a moment. "So do I," she said quietly. They moved to Harlan Creek in the early spring of 1879 after the winter broke and the roads were passable. They expanded the house on the east side as Etta had specified, the east room larger than the first, with proper framing and cedar board walls and a good window that caught the morning light exactly as she had said it would. Henry Wilcox came himself with a wagon of stock timber and a hand to help with the heavy lifting, and he and Vernon worked 3 days straight on the expansion, while Etta organized the interior with the systematic efficiency that organized everything she touched. And Eleanor stayed for a week and set the kitchen in order and sat on the porch in the April evenings and said this was a fine place. The lumber yard came next. There was a vacant lot adjacent to Vernon's quarter-acre, Lot 7 on the survey, that he purchased in May for $40, which was $40 he had earned at Wilcox Lumber over the winter, and which he had set aside specifically for this purpose. They built a small open-fronted shed for the stock and a proper office beside it and a sign that read, GARRETT Lumber and Supply, Harlan Creek, Texas. Etta painted the sign herself with a steady hand and no wasted brushstrokes. The town took note. Harlan Creek had spent years sending to Milford for lumber, which was expensive in time and freight cost, and the arrival of a local yard with competitive prices and a proprietor who knew grading and could advise on quantities was received as a substantial improvement. Orders came in from the first week: new outbuildings, a stable expansion at the Teller Ranch, a small addition to the church, fencing material for 3 different farms. Vernon handled the heavy work and the deliveries. Etta handled the accounts and the ordering and any customer who needed a direct conversation about what they actually needed versus what they thought they needed. She was very good at that last part. There was a rancher named Dowd who came in wanting enough lumber for a 20-foot barn, and who, after 15 minutes with Etta, had revised his order to include proper floor joists he had not originally planned for, 2 additional window frames for ventilation, and a loading door design that she sketched on the back of his order form while he watched, and he left saying it was the best 15 minutes he'd spent in a business establishment in years. Paco Reyes started taking his meals at their table 3 evenings a week, which began as a practical arrangement after his bunkhouse at the Teller Ranch was taken over by new hands and became a kind of permanent soft understanding. He was useful around the yard and good company and deeply fond of Etta, whom he treated with the respect and mild awe that she inspired in most sensible people. Vernon and Paco fell back into the easy friendship of men who have been through hard times together, which is the best kind of friendship. The town of Harlan Creek settled around them like a frame settling onto a solid foundation. Vernon joined the local Merchants Association, attended the church that stood on the corner of Main and 2nd, helped rebuild the road drainage after the spring floods of 1880 with 3 other men from town, and generally became one of those people whose presence in a community is noticed not because they demand it, but because they are reliably and practically useful. Etta became the person that women came to when something needed to be sorted out. The widow Dorrance, whom Vernon had been hauling water for since before the fire, became a particular friend. She would come and sit with Etta in the office on quiet afternoons, and they would drink coffee and talk about practical matters and matters that were less practical, and Etta would listen with that full, serious attention, and occasionally say something that the widow found genuinely useful. It was not exactly a social role in the conventional sense, but it was a real one, and Etta filled it in the same way she filled everything, which was entirely and on her own terms. There was also the question of the injustices of the times, which did not spare Harlan Creek entirely. The summer of 1880 brought a man named Rufus Crane, no relation to Bessie at the saloon, who set himself up as a land broker, and who had a habit of offering to buy out smaller homesteads at prices that were not fair, and who had, it emerged, connections to a Dallas company that was aggregating land along the Brazos for purposes that were not transparent. He approached Vernon in June with an offer to buy the Garrett lots, the house lot and the yard lot, at what he described as an excellent price, and which was, as Vernon calculated, roughly half of what they were worth. Vernon declined. Crane came back a second time and made the same offer with somewhat more pressure behind it. Vernon declined again and told Crane that the lots were not for sale at any price, and that the business was profitable, and that this conversation was over. Crane also approached several Mexican families on the south end of Harlan Creek, and a black family named Washington, who had been farming a quarter section east of town since 1871, with legitimate title to their land. Paco came to Vernon and Etta one evening to tell them what was happening, because Crane had apparently been considerably more aggressive with people who he calculated had less standing to push back. Etta had sat with her hands around her coffee cup and listened to all of it without expression. Then she had said, "Come Saturday, we go together, the Washingtons and the Delgado family and the Ramirez family. We go to Caldwell together and we register formal documentation of all their land titles with the county clerk's office. My father knows the county clerk. It won't solve everything, but it will make it considerably more difficult for Crane to act." Vernon had looked at her. "That's a solid move." "It's the correct move," she said, without any particular pride in it. They spent the following Saturday in Caldwell with 6 families, sitting in the county clerk's office while proper certified copies of land titles were drawn up and registered and witnessed and filed, and Etta paid the filing fees for 3 families who could not cover them and said nothing about it and did not write it down anywhere as a debt. Rufus Crane left Harlan Creek by the end of summer, destination unknown. The land scheme dissolved without its instigator. Nobody mourned the departure. Etta did not talk much about the episode afterward. When Vernon thanked her for thinking of it, she said, "It was the obvious thing to do," and turned back to whatever she was working on, and Vernon understood that this was how she was about things like that, not performing virtue, but simply exercising it, as naturally and without commentary as breathing. In September of 1880, Etta told Vernon that they were expecting their first child. She told him in the evening on the porch in the same place they had sat when he told her he loved her, and when she had agreed to marry him, and she told him in the same direct, plain way she told him everything, which was, "Vernon, I went to see Dr. Putnam today and he confirms that we're expecting a child in the spring." Vernon sat very still for a moment. Then he turned to her and looked at her face and said, "Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. "Putnam says everything looks normal and I feel fine." "I mean," he stopped. He took her hand. "Are you happy about it?" She looked at him with the full warm weight of her eyes and said, "Yes, Vernon, I am very happy about it." He brought her close and she leaned against his shoulder in the way she had taken to doing in the evenings, which was one of his favorite things in the world, and they sat together on the porch in the September night with this new fact between them. "A baby," he said. "That is generally what we're expecting," she said. He laughed and held her closer and she let him, and in the quiet that followed she said softly, "I hope it has your steadiness." "I hope it has your brain," he said. "It can have both," she said. Their son was born in the first week of April 1881, on a night that smelled of rain and new grass, with the prairie coming alive outside the windows after the long winter, and Dr. Putnam was there, and a leaner had come down from Caldwell a week early to be present, and Henry had sent word he would come as soon as the roads allowed. The birth was difficult in the way first births often are and lasted longer than anyone was comfortable with, and Vernon was not permitted in the room but sat in the kitchen with Paco and worked through half a pot of coffee and twice checked to make sure the stovepipe was drawing correctly as a way of doing something with his hands. When the cry came, the sharp, indignant, extraordinary cry of a new person entering the world, Vernon stood up so fast he knocked the coffee cup off the table, and a leaner came to the kitchen door and said, "It's a boy. They're both well," and Vernon sat back down in the chair because his legs had temporarily stopped being reliable. He named the boy Robert for his father. Robert Henry Garrett, as it turned out, since Henry Wilcox had arrived the following day with wet eyes and a wagon full of presents, including a proper cradle that he had made himself in the mill shed, which was the finest piece of woodwork Vernon had ever seen. The baby was small and loud and entirely healthy, and Etta held him in the morning light with the absolute same quality of complete attention she brought to everything, studying this new small person with serious and tender interest. And Vernon sat on the edge of the bed and watched the two of them and felt something so large and encompassing that it did not have a word for it, or if it did the word was too small. "He has your nose," Etta told him. "He has your eyes," Vernon said. "He has very red ears," she said. "That's just from being born," Vernon said. "Putnam told me they calm down." "Good," she said. She looked down at the baby. "Hello, Robert," she said quietly. "We have been expecting you." The lumber yard continued to grow through 1881 and into 1882. Vernon hired a yard hand named Cal Briley, the blacksmith Tom's youngest son, who was 18, strong and willing to learn, and the three-person operation. Vernon, Etta, and young Cal managed a volume of business that had them ordering from Henry 3 times a year rather than twice. They added a covered storage shed for the finishing lumber, a small wagon house to protect the delivery rig, and a proper loading dock that Vernon built himself on a long weekend with Paco's help. Robert grew with the particular speed of a well-loved and well-fed child, and by his second birthday, he was walking into the lumber yard on small, certain legs, and standing by the sorting table watching his mother grade planks with an expression of intense concentration that was his mother's face in miniature. Etta would narrate what she was doing as she worked, the names of the cuts and the grades, the way to read grain for strength and the way to spot moisture damage, and Robert would listen with his small face tipped up and his eyes very serious. "He is going to know this business before he can properly write his name," Vernon said one afternoon, watching. "Then we'll teach him to write his name faster," Etta said, without looking up from the plank she was assessing. In the fall of 1882, they learned they were expecting a second child, and Etta went through this pregnancy with the same practical, uncomplaining approach she brought to everything, continuing to work in the office and on the yard through the winter and into the spring, and adjusting the pace of things only when Putnam told her she was being somewhat unreasonable about rest, at which point she rested with visible and specific reluctance. Their second child was a girl, born in June of 1883, and they named her Clara. Clara Vernon Garrett, for Vernon Wilcox, who wept at the naming with a depth of feeling that required 3 handkerchiefs. Clara was different from Robert in the way that children who share parents are often entirely different. Where Robert was steady and observant and methodical, Clara was quick and bright and in constant motion, and she talked to everyone, including the horses and the yard dog and the mesquite shrubs that had grown back along the south edge of the lot. Paco adored her without reservation and taught her Spanish words that made Alina cover her mouth when Clara repeated them. And Vernon held both his children in the same way his father had held him, which was close and without self-consciousness. And Etta watched her family around the supper table some evenings, with an expression that was so far from the practical daytime face that it was another face, entirely open and warm and incandescently happy. Though she turned it away quickly if she caught Vernon looking, he always caught her looking. "You don't have to put that away," he told her one evening when the children were asleep and the house was quiet. They were washing up after supper, standing side by side at the kitchen basin, and he had seen her turn the expression away. "What expression?" she said, though she knew. "The one that means you are happy," he said. He handed her the dish towel. "You don't have to put it away when I'm looking." She took the towel and dried her hands and looked at him in the lamp light. She was 29 years old, and she was more beautiful to him than she had been when she drove a wagon into his lot with a list in her hand, and that had been something considerable. "Old habit," she said. "I grew up thinking it was undignified to show that much." "It's not undignified," he said. "It's the best thing I've seen in years, every time." She looked at him for a moment with the full, serious attention. Then she said, "Vernon Garrett," and she stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he held her in the kitchen with the lamp light and the smell of supper and the sound of their sleeping children's breathing coming from the back room, and he pressed his mouth to her hair and thought that this particular moment contained every good thing he had ever wanted. "I am the happiest I have ever been," she said quietly into his shoulder, not performing it, not announcing it, just stating a fact the way she stated all facts. "So am I," he said. "So am I." Henry Wilcox made the trip to Harlan Creek twice a year in these years, and each visit involved a thorough inspection of the yard and the house and the children with equal parts professional assessment and grandfatherly pride. He and Vernon would sit after supper and talk about the lumber business and about the state of Texas generally, the railroads coming through and what that would mean for supply chains, the range disputes up north between cattlemen and the new farmers moving in, the question of whether Harlan Creek might grow into a town with a proper bank now that it was approaching a population of 300. "It'll have a bank inside 5 years," Henry said on a November visit in 1883, sitting on the porch with his pipe while Vernon sat beside him with his coffee. "You should be thinking about property." "I've been thinking about property," Vernon said. "There are 2 lots on the North Street that came up for sale this spring, towns growing north." "Buy them," Henry said. "I intend to," Vernon said. He bought them in December. He built a small warehouse on one, which became the new storage facility for the yard, considerably expanding their capacity. The other lot he held, which turned out to be sound thinking when the town voted in 1885 to build a new school and needed to purchase adjacent land, and Vernon sold the lot to the town at a fair price that was nonetheless considerably more than he had paid for it. Etta had told him to hold it. She had said it at the time of purchase. "Hold the second one. The town will need land when the school question comes up, and it will come up." "How do you know the school question will come up?" he had asked. "Because the school is in a building that is 40 years old and too small for the current enrollment, and the citizens of this town are not foolish," she had said. She had been correct, as she was generally correct about these things. The third child came in the summer of 1885, another boy, whom they named James, for Etta's favorite of her older brothers, who received this news by letter and sent back an enormously long response expressing pride and gratitude that covered both sides of 3 pages and made Etta read it twice, which she only did with things that moved her. James was the loudest of the 3 children at birth and remained so for the first 2 years of his life, and Clara, who was 2 when he was born, received this new sibling with the mixture of delight and territorial suspicion that 2-year-olds bring to most developments. Robert, at 4, took his role as elder sibling with a seriousness that made Paco say he was going to be a foreman before he was 12. The years moved through the second half of the 1880s in the way that good years do, not slowly but not so fast that you can't hold them. The lumber yard expanded again. Cal Briley, who had grown into a reliable and capable young man, became the yard foreman in all but name, and Vernon was able to step back from the daily physical work enough to handle more of the business development side, which he found he had a better instinct for than he had expected. The railroad reached a junction town 30 miles south in 1886, which changed the economics of supply significantly and favorably for a yard with an established credit line and ordering relationships. Harlan Creek grew. The bank came as Henry had predicted. A second church went up. The school was rebuilt. 3 new mercantile operations opened along the main street. The hotel that had once felt like an optimistic extravagance was consistently busy. Etta ran the business office with absolute precision and an expanding network of customer relationships that she maintained through the quality of her attention and the reliability of her word. Because Etta Garrett said what she would do and did it, every time, and in the commerce of a small western town, this was worth more than advertising or persuasion. She was also, quietly and without making it a campaign, a woman that people came to for help. The school expansion committee came to her when they could not make the budget work, and she sat with the committee treasurer for a full afternoon and found them $400 of waste in the original estimate. The Methodist Ladies Auxiliary, which ran a small support operation for families in difficulty, began directing the most complex cases in her direction, not because she held any formal position, but because she was the person who could look at a complicated situation and identify the actual problem and the actual solution without sentiment obscuring the view. She helped 3 families hold their land in the drought year of 1886 by working outcrop lien arrangements that were fair rather than predatory. She corresponded with a women's teacher training program in Austin on behalf of two young women in town who wanted to become teachers and who had no one else to navigate the application requirements for them. She did all of this in the margins of running a business and a household and raising 3 children, and she did not consider any of it exceptional. Vernon noticed all of it. He noticed because he paid attention to her with the same quality of attention that she paid to everything fully, without gaps. And what he saw, year by year, was a woman who had arrived in his ruined life with lumber and a list, and refused to let him retreat into nothing, who had rebuilt him before he understood what was happening, and who had gone on building ever since, not just in the literal sense of boards and nails and ledger lines, but in the deeper sense of building the specific kind of life that a person with real values and real intelligence makes when she decides to commit to a place and the people in it. He told her this on the evening of their 10th anniversary, sitting on the porch in November of 1888 with the night cold now and a proper fire going inside, the children asleep after a supper that Alina and Henry had come down for, and that had involved a cake that Clara had mostly decorated, and Robert had mostly eaten before supper without anyone technically noticing. Henry and Alina were inside. The 3 children were asleep. Vernon and Etta were on the porch in their coats with hot coffee and the stars brilliant and specific overhead in the cold, dry air, and Vernon said, "I want to tell you something." She leaned her shoulder against his. "Tell me." "I have been trying to work out," he said, "what the right thing to say is for 10 years. And I keep running into the problem that everything I think of sounds like less than what I mean." She turned her head to look at him, her breath misted slightly in the cold air. "You don't have to find something new," she said. "You tell me every day." "I want to say it properly," he said. She waited. "You came to me when I had nothing," he said. "Not just the material nothing, the other kind. The kind where a man doesn't know if he has anything left to build a life from. And you came with lumber and a list, and you didn't ask me to be grateful, and you didn't look at me like I was something to be pitied, and you just showed up and you made something possible." He paused. He looked out at the dark yard and the shapes of the lumber shed and the house they had built together. "And everything that came after, Robert and Clara and James and this place, and the work we do together, and the fact that I wake up in the morning knowing exactly what my life is and being glad of it, all of it comes from that one morning in the road." Etta was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady but only just. "You would have rebuilt yourself," she said. "With or without the wagon." "Maybe," he said, "but not this particular thing." He turned to look at her. "Not you." She looked at him in the cold starlight, and there was the expression again, the one that was her real face, the one she kept for moments when the practical shell fell away, and what was underneath it was this, warm and deep and entirely his. "Vernon," she said. "Etta," he said. "I came to Harlan Creek because of a debt," she said. "I stayed because of you. And I have not regretted a single day of it." She took his hand inside both of hers. "Not one day." He brought her close, and she leaned against him, and they sat together in the cold November night, and listened to the wind in the mesquite, and the distant sound of something moving on the road to the south, probably a late rider or a freight wagon, the ordinary sounds of a living town in 1888. Inside the house the fire was burning in the stone hearth that Vernon had built with rocks from the creek bed, and the 3 children were asleep in the rooms they had added over the years as the family had grown, and Henry and Etta Wilcox were sitting at the kitchen table with their evening coffee, talking in the quiet way of people who have been married for a very long time and are comfortable in a silence that has history in it. Out on the porch, Etta said, "I want to tell you something too." "Tell me." "I am going to have another child," she said. He went completely still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her, and she was watching him with that serious, direct gaze, and there was the small smile at the corner of her mouth, and her eyes were bright. "Another one," he said. "Dr. Putnam confirmed it last week," she said. "I wanted to tell you tonight. I thought it was the right occasion." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, the real laugh that she had first surprised out of him on the south side of Caldwell in the willow shade, the one that had nothing performed about it. "You planned that for the anniversary," he said. "I did not plan the child for the anniversary," she said, primly but with the smile fully present now. "The announcement," he said. She considered. "I may have arranged the timing of the announcement." He pulled her close and she let him, and he pressed his face into her hair and held her in the cold night with the great and specific gratitude of a man who knows exactly how fortunate he is. "Boy or girl," he said. "We'll see," she said. "What do you want?" She thought about it. "A girl," she said. "One more girl. Clara needs an ally. James will not be reasonable to live with indefinitely." He laughed again. "Fair." In the spring of 1889 their fourth child was born, a girl, as Etta had wanted, healthy and red-eared and loudly present from the first moment. They named her Me, for a gray-tan of Vernon's who had been, by all family accounts, a formidable and independent-minded woman who had run a trading post in East Texas for 30 years and was remembered with great affection. Me Etta Garrett, as it happened, because Etta Wilcox had cried at Clara's middle name, and the expectation was firmly established. Henry Wilcox, who had seen a great deal in 60-some years of hard work and timber, and raising children and rebuilding after disaster, said at the supper table the night of Me's birth, holding the new baby in his wide, capable hands while the other 3 grandchildren climbed around him, "Robert, I want you to look at this house." Robert, who was 8 and took things seriously, looked at the house. "Your father built this house," Henry said, "from boards that your mother brought him in a wagon on a September morning in 1878. Do you know that story?" "Yes, sir," Robert said. "Tell me what you know." Robert sat up straight on the bench in the way of a child who has been asked to demonstrate knowledge. "Pa had a fire and lost everything. Grandpa sent Mama with lumber because great-grandfather Garrett helped you when your mill burned down in 1859. Mama drove the wagon herself because she wanted to see what kind of man Pa was. She brought 16 pine planks and 4 cross beams and 140 nails and a handsaw and a hammer and a draw knife and roofing tin, and she had a list." He paused. "And Pa built the house in 12.5 days. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Henry Wilcox looked across the table at Vernon, who was looking at his son with an expression that had several things in it at once. 12.5, Henry said. "Your boy got the details right." "He gets the details from his mother," Vernon said. Etta, who was sitting beside Vernon with Me bundled in her arms, looked at Robert with a warmth that could have heated the room. "You remembered all of that," she said to him. "You told me before," Robert said. "Last winter when we were stacking the cedar planks and I asked why the house is made of pine except for the back room." "The back room is cedar," Etta said to Vernon. He noticed the wood difference. Vernon looked at his 8-year-old son and felt the specific and quietly enormous pride of a parent whose child is becoming exactly himself. "Come here," Vernon said to Robert. Robert came around the table and Vernon put his arm around him and held him against his side. And Robert sat against his father's arm and looked at baby Me with the serious expression of an elder sibling meeting the newest arrival. "She's very small," Robert said. "You were smaller," Etta told him. "I find that difficult to believe," Robert said. Clara from across the table said I was the smallest. Putnam said so, with the authority of a 6-year-old who has taken a firm position and will not be moved from it. James at 3.5 said Me, very clearly and with what appeared to be genuine affection, reaching toward the baby, and Etta guided his small hand to the baby's hand, and Me wrapped her tiny fingers around James's finger with the instinctive grip of the newborn, and James looked at this with enormous eyes. "She's holding me," he said. "She is," Etta said. "She's strong," he said. "She is," Vernon said. "She's a Garrett." We build things to last. The kitchen was warm and full and bright, and outside the prairie was wide and dark and going slowly green in the April evening, and in the stone hearth, the fire that Vernon had built himself in the house he had built himself from lumber that the woman beside him had brought to his lot 11 years ago burned clean and steady. He reached across and took Etta's hand where it lay on the table, carefully so as not to disturb the baby, and she turned her head and looked at him with the full warmth of her real face, the one she had stopped putting away some years ago, when she finally accepted that he was going to keep looking, and she was going to keep being glad of it. 12.5 days, he said quietly. You're not going to let that half day go, are you? She said. I built a good house, he said. You built a very good house, she said, and looked around it, the stone hearth, the cedar walls of the back room, the window with the evening light coming through, the people around the table. You keep building it, she said softly. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. Henry Wilcox cleared his throat because the kitchen was getting somewhat emotional, and he had a grandchild on his knee and needed to compose himself. And Alina passed him a biscuit, which was her solution to most things, and James asked if there was more apple preserves, and Clara said she had already eaten James's portion, which led to a spirited exchange that filled the kitchen with noise and life. And Vernon Garrett, who had stood in the ash of everything he owned on a September morning in 1878, believing that there was nothing left worth reaching for, sat at the table in the house he had built, with the family he had been given by a woman who had driven out from Caldwell with lumber and a list, and refused to accept his gratitude, and reached for everything. He reached for all of it every day, and he never once stopped being grateful, not for the debt it represented, not in the speech-making, comfortable distance way that Etta had so accurately identified and refused, but in the true and daily way, the way that shows up in the morning and builds something and keeps building, the way that looks at the person beside you across the supper table, or in the lamplight, or on the porch in the cold November dark, and knows, with the full and certain weight of a well-fitted board, that this is the most solid thing you have ever made. The stars over Harlan Creek were very bright that spring of 1889, and the prairie smelled of new grass, and the Garrett house was full of light and noise, and the particular, irreplaceable warmth of people who have chosen each other and kept choosing, and the fire that had taken everything had given, in the end, something greater than what it took. That is the way of fires sometimes, when you are lucky, when someone shows up with lumber,